Welcome everyone to I think Linda's 12th week of Profound Conversations, or is 11th? 11th episode of Profound Conversations. My name is Kareem Ali, executive producer, partner with Muslim Life Planning Institute, and today's discussion is part two, the American social epidemic of violence and racism, transforming anguish into purpose through the pursuit of freedom, justice, and equity. A little bit about Profound Conversations for our audience, and I see audience members who have been here before. Profound Conversations is a listening and discussion space which brings foremost thought leaders into a conversation to grapple with the vexing challenges of today. We use intercultural dialogue, extensive community and organizational engagement to initiate valuable cultural, educational, economic, and policy outcomes. And we'd like to say, in an ever-evolving world, new ideas and transformative ways of being are the lights at the end of the tunnel. Hence, while we've brought many lights here today, representing sectors of the various sectors of our community, law enforcement, education, public health, governance sector, community building. And I want to now turn it over to our host extraordinaire, Miss Linda Howard. Linda, please take it away.
Okay. Thank you and welcome everybody. This, as Kareem mentioned, this is our 11th episode of Profound Conversations. Today's episode is a part two. We did part one last week, and if you missed that episode, please visit our website and listen to it, because it was through that profound conversation that we concluded that we needed to keep this particular discussion going. So we brought 6 new profound conversationalists to the conversation today. But before we get started, I wanted to just kind of share some of my thoughts. We've been talking about policing and a culture of violence and racism in America, and we've been engaging in these profound conversations to get to some breakthroughs. But in order for us to do that, we have to hear many voices. We have to hear many views. We have to understand the impact that this has on the community. We have to understand the mindset of police officers and the challenges, the biases, the fears, the police leadership, and the role that even the police unions play. And we also have to understand the pain at the family level and what families experience when they get that call. And I can tell you from personal experience, having gotten that call twice in my family, my youngest brother, as well as my nephew, both were killed through gun violence. And I understand what impact that has on the family, what impact that has on parents. And then I take that and I think about what families experience when they get that call that a family member's life has been taken by someone who was trusted with the authority to protect them. Very rarely is there any charges filed. And even when there are charges, there's very rarely a conviction. So we want to also just think about what that experience is like to get the call, to even when there's charges, to sit in a courtroom and hear a non-guilty verdict. And we're not in this conversation just to kind of rehash some of the obvious, but in order for us to get through some breakthroughs, and we've concluded that we got to hear many voices, and we have to have this comprehensive approach. And in this conversation, I'm bringing all of me to this conversation. The African-American woman who has nephews who've experienced the violence with our own family, but I'm also bringing in my experience as a compliance and ethics officer, which I've done for over 15 years. And what I know from that experience is that in order for you to have compliance, you have to implement every single element of an effective compliance program. And so when we're talking today, I'm hoping that we can co-create what those effective elements are for us to get to a place where we have good policing and where we create a culture in America where we don't have the violence, we don't have the bias, and we don't have the racism. So before I kind of open it up for our profound conversationalists to jump in, I just want to put a few things on the table that I want to carry over from my experience as a compliance and ethics officer and some of those elements. And one is that we got to have those policies and procedures. Those policies and procedures don't mean anything if we don't train to them. Well, we got to have training. If we don't enforce them, where people fear that there is going to be a disciplinary action, that there's going to be punishment when you violate those policies and procedures. We also have to have monitoring to make sure it works. We have to have clear methods of communication where people can feel that they can report things. And when they report those things, that there is not going to be a retaliation. And if we kind of move forward to where we were with the George Floyd situation, even if we had the policies and procedures in place, if those police officers did not fear punishment, it doesn't mean anything. And we've been in a position where we've been reacting. So we have violence, we have unjustified killings or questionable killings. And we say, okay, give police officers body cams. Well, that didn't help at all to save the life of George Floyd, because you have to have every single element, and we have to bring these different voices to the discussion. So today, the previous conversation, the future conversations, I'm bringing all of me into this conversation. Muslim life planning, our leadership, we're bringing all of us into this conversation. So I'm asking our profound conversationalists today to bring all of you into this conversation. This is not a conversation to be experts. This is not an academic conversation. This is a family conversation that we're in to get through some breakthroughs. So on that note, I am not going to do an introduction of each panelist and tell you all of their credentials. Just everybody know we got some heavyweights in this conversation. And so I will ask each and every panelist to just take a few minutes to tell us your name, who you are, and why you are in this conversation. And I'm going to start, well, but my screen, what I'm looking at Colonel Russell. So can you start us off?
Sure. Well, you just said who I was. So yeah, actually I'm a retired colonel / chief, as well as acting deputy commissioner from Baltimore Police Department, where I did just shy of 40 years. So pretty much a place that I grown up in Baltimore City. I'm also still an assistant pastor in Baltimore City. And I joined the conversation because I believe in social justice, economic justice, and everything else when we talk about justice. And Kareem and I connected some years back and have been doing some work together. And I've been sick and tired for a very, very long time of the system of corruption and discrimination and everything else that really affects people of color. And so anytime I get an opportunity from an organization that I know is serious about the movement, serious about talking about bringing around or incorporating social justice and getting us on a playing field where there is equality across the board, I'm there. So for me, it's more than just talking about it. The conversation is nice, the dialogue is nice, but it's got to be backed by some action. It's got to be backed by some policy changes and a whole lot of other things. I've always said this, and I'll shut up with this. You know, our people are really good at raising their voices in time of crisis, like with George Floyd, you know, whether it's, you know, Eric Gardner. For us, it was Freddie Gray, Michael Brown. So we're really good at raising our voices for 30, maybe 90 days. And I'm a firm believer in this. I don't have any data to back this up, but then we die off. We kind of go back to business as usual. And when that happens, I just believe those that are who like status quo pretty much can wait us out and don't mind knowing that they will pretty much die off in a couple of months and we'll go back to business as usual. And I've been telling my wife, this is a time now that I pray. We've been shaken so bad with this last event, this last horrific event with George Floyd, that we absolutely do not go back into our corners and call time out and just get more of the same treatment. But we absolutely stand, continue to cry, and not just cry out about it, but do it in a way that's smart. There's no loitering, not loitering. There's no looting. There's no rioting. But we use our brain power to really get policy changes in this country. Because until then, nothing's going to happen. And I'll absolutely say this: rules without consequences. Rules without consequences, which we've been dealing with for a long time, especially within a system. When there's no consequences, when people break the rules within a system, it breeds corruption and it promotes lawlessness in that order. And that's what we're dealing with now. We just got to that point now that people said, you know what, enough is enough. And we're not talking about it anymore. And now they're doing what they think they need to do.
Wow, thank you. Justin.
Thank you for having me. My name is Justin Hodge. I'm a clinical assistant professor at the University of Michigan School of Social Work. I primarily teach policy courses and courses to get social work students to get engaged in policy and political work. I'm also the chair of the Washtenaw County Sheriff's Community Advisory Board for Law Enforcement. So this conversation is particularly timely for us right now. We had an incident of police use of force very recently here, and my board is going through a process right now of collecting public comment. And we'll be having a conversation with the sheriff very soon, and my board will be doing a citizens review of the incident. In addition to that, I'm part of this conversation to talk about how we can take these changes that we all know need to happen, but move them into the policy realm. I'm currently running for Washtenaw County Commissioner, and my hope is to, as an elected official, be able to promote more socially just policies. And I mean, that's something that we really need to do. We need to galvanize all this attention on these really important issues, but turn them into policy.
Okay. Major Franklin.
Hi, my name is Neill Franklin, and I'm from Baltimore. I've been in policing. Well, I've got a policing career of over 34 years, now retired. Maryland State Police, Baltimore City, and Maryland Transit. And for the past 10 years, I've been the executive director of the Law Enforcement Action Partnership, LEAP for short. And we are a nonprofit organization. We're international, but we are a collection of police, prosecutors, judges, corrections officials, parole and probation, federal agents, and more, members of the criminal justice community who have been pretty much doing this work within our neighborhoods and communities and continue to do this work. We are retired members. We are also active members of those disciplines I just mentioned. And although we have thousands of members from around the globe, we have just under 300 who we consider experts, who are ambassadors, our speakers for carrying the messages of not so much reform, because reform can be about just remolding something. You still have the same problems. It just looks different. We are solution oriented. So we look at the issues and problems we're having within our justice system, and collectively, all these disciplines, we come up with solutions. We educate folks by writing op-eds, we do publications, we speak at conferences, universities, any community-based organization or group. We do a lot of webinars. We host at least 1 or 2 webinars every month. And a big part of what we do is educating our policymakers at the state, local, and federal levels on the need for policy change. And we also focus on public policy, which is huge for us, in either working to eliminate problematic public policy. And we also try to do our best with keeping an eye out for the development, the creation of problem public policy, so that we can push back against the implementation of public policy that could be problematic. A lot of the work we do is focused upon the Black community and policing within the Black community, the entire justice system, because the data is clear, and not just by a little, but Blacks are arrested, charged, convicted, and have higher sentences than whites by far in this country. So we do that work. And I'll end with this. The 5 silos of work that we do are centered in police community relations, incarceration, drug policy, harm reduction, and then global issues. And under each one of those silos of work, you'll see just a very large collection of micro issues that we focus on. And of course, with what we're dealing with today over the past couple of weeks, with the murder of George Floyd, and it's been said, we know it's not just about George Floyd, it's about all the other Black bodies that have come before George Floyd. And so we've been focused on that work for years. And so anyway, we cannot let this moment escape us in the work that we need to do. So that's it.
Thank you. Adar.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. I'm excited about the conversation. I am the Senior Director of Strategy and Racial Equity with Associated Black Charities, which is a public foundation in Baltimore, Maryland. I also engage this work through Baltimore Racial Justice Action, which is a group of facilitators and trainers and citizens and residents who are interested in racial justice, not only in Baltimore, not only in the state of Maryland, but in doing what we can where we can. With Associated Black Charities, I do trainings and facilitations with institutions, with businesses, with nonprofit organizations, sharing with them how to incorporate a quote unquote racial equity lens in their policies and their practices. I also work with our policy makers to help them understand how essential it is to craft, to monitor, to evaluate policies that are fair for all of our citizens. And as we know, what we see happening now is not just what is happening now. It is 400 years of policies which privilege some people and disadvantage others, which have an impact on every single aspect of life in this country. And if we are going to craft change, we need to first acknowledge that this has been a 400-year battle for the soul of America. And then we need to figure out those things that we need for justice, racial justice, and for repair, and for moving forward together. And that is why I am here today.
Wow. Thank you for being here. And we have DeBorah.
Good afternoon, everybody. Linda, thank you very much for asking me to be a part of this most profound conversation that we're having with some, for me, new family members I haven't met before, Brother Kareem and Brother Samuel. It's good to be a part of this, so I thank all of you all. I am with a nonprofit organization in St. Louis, Missouri called Better Family Life Incorporated. The national headquarters sits here in St. Louis. And for a lot of folks who may be in the audience, St. Louis got on the map when Ferguson erupted on August 10th, actually, 2014, after the murder of Michael Brown on August 9th, 2014. Better Family Life for the past 37 years has been doing work primarily for and with African Americans. And we believe that our work is centered in uniting families and empowering communities. And we do that by providing hope, comprehensive services, and meaningful opportunities for everybody and anybody who comes to our doors. What we have seen in the past 37 years of our existence is Black folks expressing a lack of self-love. And one of the reasons that we constantly find ourselves, we believe, in the situations that we are is because when we look at people who look like ourselves, we don't love them because we don't love ourselves. So what does that do? It makes us open, it makes us vulnerable to anybody from the outside coming in. And I always say that doesn't excuse the behavior of anybody who's on the outside coming in, because what has been happening to us recently, historically, since we were brought to the shores of this continent by people who meant us no good, who saw us as human chattel, as property, is they have done deeds that have been despicable to us. And they have continued to this day. And what the whole world saw a little more than 2 weeks ago was a Black man being murdered. And I am so glad to see that so many young people are involved in this, in the outcry now of this will not happen anymore. I'm also glad to see a lot of white folks involved in it too. How long is it going to last? I don't know. I am like the brother who spoke earlier, that a lot of times this lasts 30, 60, or 90 days, but hopefully this fire has been lit permanently, because we all saw it. Nobody had to edit a videotape. There were no edited videotapes of what we just saw. It was blatant murder of a brother who said, "Stop, I cannot breathe." Other people saying, "Stop, he cannot breathe. Get your foot off his neck." And he didn't. So here we are having another conversation. And we know, I know, at Better Family Life, we practice that we are the same people whom we serve. And we have to believe and practice that we have the ability to change our reality so that we can restore ourselves to our traditional greatness. So with that being said, Linda, I pass it back to you.
Thank you. And finally, but certainly not least, is Dr. Lewis.
Good afternoon, everyone. Our system is broken. This system of government, democracy is broken, and it has to be fixed. Okay, we're gonna have to deal with all kinds of issues, and of course, this latest incident involving the murder of George Floyd once again remind us that we have a long way to go and to create a society that's going to treat Black people like citizens. I've been really into James Baldwin lately, and I guess I discovered him at a late age. I had read some of his books, but now I'm really listening to what he has to say. And one of the things he said that really struck me was, he says, you're not a second-class citizen, all right? He said, he was asked about being a citizen struggling for his civil rights. He said, if you're a citizen, you don't have to struggle for your freedom rights, civil rights. You have your civil rights. So I am a social worker. I am a product of the Black church. My father, I'm a PK, but at one point, I was working in a Black church in Brooklyn, St. Paul Community Baptist Church in East New York, with African American males. And my father died when I was 16, and so I kind of lost my way, and I didn't have a focus. I didn't have a purpose. So I went, I did different things and not really kind of zero in. But long story short is that so I was in this church at 42, and I was telling these brothers that they needed to go back to school. So I went back to school, got my BA, because I had been in clinical counseling. I thought, I'm going to go and learn how to be a clinical counselor, then I can come back and work with these brothers one-on-one. And then I discovered policy, because I realized as much as you do in terms of the clinical counseling, unless you pay attention to the policies, it's going to be an uphill struggle. So long story short, that's where my focus is now. My nonprofit focuses on helping social workers engage with the political arena, because I feel that our values and skills and knowledge will be useful there. And I'll talk a little bit more later about some of the things that I'm doing specifically.
Okay, great. So there's two things that I've heard a couple of people mention in this, in your introductions, is a skepticism about how long will this last? Is this the 30 to 60 to 90 days and then it fizzles out? The question that I asked last week of our profound conversationalist is what makes this particular incident different? I know in 2015, I did a presentation surrounding questionable police shootings, and I put together a spreadsheet, and I think in 2015, I was up to 75 that I had cataloged starting back from Amadou Diallo, and that was in 1999. And most of those situations, there was not a conviction. There was not even an arrest or charges, and then in most of those situations there was no conviction, and we don't know those names. I mean, we've now, when we hear people talking, we hear about 5 or 6 names, but that was 2015 when I came up with 75 names. So I'm asking the question, what's different? And I want to throw this question out to DeBorah to talk about a little bit, what do you see as a difference with this situation in Ferguson and those that are in Maryland, to talk about what's the difference between this situation and what we experienced in Baltimore with Freddie Gray. And so I am going to open it up for our profound conversationalist to jump in.
So I see a few differences. One I mentioned in my introduction. First one being that we saw somebody murdered. And at my age in my life, I've never experienced that before. We saw somebody begging for their life. We saw somebody have the opportunity to stop. We heard people cry out, stop, stop, stop. And the man didn't stop. And the other people who were there, the other 3 officers, they did not intervene to stop it. So we saw brutality on a very animalistic level. And in the social arena, what we saw was racism in its systemic form. We saw a lack of humanity. We saw a lack of empathy. We saw a lack of compassion in a very basic form. So that's one difference. I think another difference is that it is shot out all over the world. So other countries around the world, other people in other countries around the world are rallying to support us, 1, and 2, to speak out about their own racial injustices that they are experiencing in their home countries. 3, in this country, we're seeing probably millions now, not only of people, but of white Americans coming out and speaking out against this, which is a whole different voice that we're hearing. And many of them are young people. So those, for me, those are the 3 major differences that I'm seeing that differentiates the recent murders that we all know about of African Americans at the hands of the police, primarily Black men, and what is occurring today. And another thing is that we're seeing an asinine human being who was elected, should I say selected, as the president of this country, who is not showing any connectivity to the tragedy of what has occurred and the voices that are crying out to say, this must not happen again.
Right. All right. Be Morris in the house. What's different would be what happened with Freddie Gray.
If I may, so the DeBorah hit the nail on the head. It's pretty much the same thing, and I will work backwards. I say the number one thing that's different, first of all, it just feels different. I think we all can agree with that. And the reason it feels so much different is this has really been a wake-up call, not just for people of color. Yeah, we had some of our white brothers and sisters with us during the Freddie Gray uprising, civil unrest, riots, whatever you want to call them. But this is way different. This is way different. And I think it's different because the accumulation of these type of tragic events. And I hear my beloved sister Deborah said, this time we've seen a murder, but I remind us that we saw almost the same thing happen to Eric Gardner, who was yelling, "I can't breathe," and that was filmed. And we saw the murder take place, just like we see here, excuse me, with George Floyd. So I think the accumulation, please forgive me. I think the accumulation of everything that we're seeing, and it's coming so quickly now, back to back to back to back. There were a time when you saw these atrocities happening years apart. It seems like they're happening every couple of months now. We're seeing this, and I think it just got to the point, sick and tired of sick and tired. And then my beloved sister really hit the nail on the head. During Freddie Gray, we had number 44, the beloved, the wonderful President Barack Obama, who was compassionate for the whole country, as well as that incident. Now we have number 45. I have difficulty saying his name. We have number 45, who's driving racism, who's allowed these people, it's almost empowered these people who are racist. It's given them the freedom to be these racists. You know, and I had difficulties when he first took office, and he talked to, I guess he thought he was talking to us police officers, and Neill, you'll remember this, when he told law enforcement across the country, don't be so nice when you lock up the bad guys. Be rough with them. When you put them in the car, make sure you hit their head against the roof of the car as you put them into the car. Just stupid and asinine things that he was saying. And I thought, man, he don't know what he just said. He had no idea what he just said. And then just think of everything he has not said. Everything he has said and has not said has absolutely fueled the flames to what's going on now and did nothing to de-escalate anything. So you have now more division in this country than ever. You've empowered white privilege. That's what you've done. And you demoralized and absolutely reiterated that people of color are secondary, if even that, people in this country. And so you have the two now going at each other. And I thank God that you have people who are not people of color who are raising up and saying, you know what, this is wrong. This is wrong. But I think those three things are really the difference. That's what's going on right now. The wake up, and I thank God it's hitting all across the country. I never thought I would see indigenous people from around the world. I was just looking at Australia, how they're being killed at a higher rate percentage than colored people, black people in the United States. Absolutely, I was floored by that. I was absolutely floored by that, but nobody's talking about it. So you see now people standing up all across the world against this racism, and I am so grateful. And I will say what many commentators have said, I absolutely believe that George Floyd's death, his murder will not be in vain. It's got to bring policy changes, and shame on all of us if we don't see that through.
Yeah, I'll be real brief because.
I'm sorry, can I chime in from Baltimore?
Yeah, go ahead.
I would say this, you know, I agree with everything that has been said thus far. And I will just add that the blatancy of it, right? The blatancy of it. When the image of the police with hands in pockets, standing almost in a hunter stance, like some hunters do when they are exhibiting an animal as a trophy that they have just killed. That is very blatant, and the number of videos that we see coming out, just as television and the showing of violence in the 1960s, the showing of racial violence on TV in the 60s, spurred not only a Black America who had been talking about this for generations, but a white America who was long complacent with it, comfortable with it, and complicit with it. Those same conditions were happening today. This is what has been said by Black people in terms of police abuses and brutality, in terms of other forms of violence, including policy violence. Black people and brown people have been speaking out against this in the vineyard tolling to make changes for generations. But we have COVID-19. We have a white supremacist in the White House. We have 58% of white people who voted for this white supremacist in the White House, right? And I am not saying, and I want to be very clear, I'm not saying that everybody who voted for Trump is a racist. I don't know that. I don't even care. What I'm saying is that 58% of white people who voted, and it was an extremely racialized vote. There were no other people of color who voted for him in those high percentages. They were comfortable voting for someone who ran a white racialized campaign. So all of that is going on here. And I think that just like in the 60s in that third phase or fourth phase of the civil rights movement, the King movement, you had a tipping point that was less than 25% of the general population, right? Now we have a tipping point where people are taking charge, taking heed, and showing out. Will it move to policy? I hope that it will, but only time will tell. But I think that is the difference, the blatancy of the actions of those acting under color of law.
So I'll be brief. This is Neill, also from Baltimore. And I'll do my best not to repeat any of the great comments that have already been made. So I'll go ahead and begin with some that haven't, but I will segue with this, what Melvin was saying regarding number 45 in the White House. I think that also people recognize during this critical moment, November is right around the corner, and they realize how critical it is to get number 45 out of the White House for all the things that have been said about him on this webinar right now from the other panelists. So we have that. Now we have the Black Lives Matter movement is now a positive movement being embraced by so many people. You know, number 45 and others were trying to make this seem as a hate group. Not anymore, folks. It's painted on the streets of Washington, D.C., leading up to the White House. Absolutely critical in this. And then I'll end my comments with this. Even in the wake of that visual murder of George Floyd by a police officer, the police still have the audacity to use violence during peaceful protests. And so people are seeing with their own eyes, with video after video after video, that even with this horrific murder, the police are still out there pushing and shoving people and using tear gas and rubber bullets close up doing peaceful protests. And they're still out there, you know, arresting Black folks for jaywalking and just these minor, in fact, they're still acting up in a violent way. And people are continuing to see this and they recognize the urgency. Oh, and the final thing, the UN, United Nations, is now on this also, looking at this situation here and policing in the United States as a human rights issue from the United Nations. And that's tied to the global attention.
Wow. So if you tuned into any of our earlier broadcasts, you know, I frequently started out saying we want to just kind of establish where we are. Like, this is where we are, folks. And before we can even start thinking about where do we go from here, it's just really acknowledging where we are. And I think, you know, the profound conversationalist today has given us a good picture about where we are, what's happening in the country right now, where we are as a society, and some of the history that brought us here. But I want us to kind of in the next part of this to really start thinking about, you know, what's the next steps? What are the solutions? How do we begin to effectuate change? But before we do that, anyone can jump in here, but I think we might need to do a little bit of an education lesson. And because if I look at some of the comments that I've gotten from people, I've had people ask me exactly what is institutionalized racism, what is systemic racism, you know, what is this thing around implicit bias? And I know a few of you are really out there doing some of that work. So if maybe we can just take about 2 minutes and just give a little bit of an education about some of these terms that we hear being thrown around.
I'll jump in and start. Institutional racism really talks about those policies, those practices that happen within our institutions, right? But the policies and the practices are interwoven together. And I'll use this as an example. EEOC guidelines, right? Every single institution has to operate under those, which supposedly help guard against discrimination. But those don't necessarily mention or talk about anti-Blackness. They don't mention or talk about implicit bias or any except the most blatant ways in which we see racism, white supremacy, ableism, and other ism forms operate within our culture. So that really is what we're talking about when we talk about that. It is mostly invisible because it is often just the way that we do business, but yet it has profound impact. Structural racism is the ways in which those things are woven through, between, above and under our systems, our structures, everything that operates within society. So for instance, when we talk about news, right, news shows, and I am a news show junkie, God help me, but when we see experts, the people who come up as experts, it is mostly, until all of this started happening, panels of white men and maybe white women. When we look at TV, and particularly in this area, if we're talking about criminals or violence, we're talking not about the people in the suburbs or the people in rural areas, we're talking about Black people. So it is the ways in which we receive both implicit and explicit messages about our role in society and where we are and where we should be. And a lot of what we're reacting to, or what society reacts to now, while we see everybody having a meltdown, is because that social contract about where people should be is no longer being adhered to.
Okay. DeBorah, you want to weigh in?
You're right. Institutionalized and systemic racism run parallel to each other. They are journeys down the same road. And it allows people who see themselves, white folks, because in order to be a racist, you have to have power. You know, you cannot be a racist without power, whether it is perceived power or real power. It must be present. And generally with that type of power to implement comes the financial capability to implement and sustain. So it allows white people, systemic and institutionalized racism, to practice their haughtiness of who they are, how they see themselves in the world in relationship to people of color in particular. And they really don't have to work that hard because the social structures allow them to be and to operate in that space, and is supportive of that. So when you go for a job, right, as an African American, the person who's interviewing you, who is a Caucasian, just may make a little note on the application that's part of their practice, right? To let someone know who sees that application, or even to remind them that this is somebody of color and I have this impression of them. That's how institutionalized racism works. And when that white person comes in after that Black person or somebody of color who doesn't even have the same background, right? Qualifications in quotes, experience for real, to get that job over that Black person who came in before them, because that Black person is not wanted, they're not needed, they're not seen as an asset within that work environment. So it allows for racism to occur, and it is not a whole lot of work that's required on the individual because the system supports it. And it happens over and over and over again.
Okay. Now, before we, because I want to throw a couple of questions to those that have that history in law enforcement. But Adar, I want to go back to, you mentioned a social contract. Can you just tell us what you meant by this social contract?
Mm-hmm. So every society, every institution operates under a social contract. It is a social contract of laws. It is a social contract which defines what is good, what is bad, our mores for doing things, right? It also defines how words are used, for instance. And so, for instance, how the word violence is used. And if you notice that in our society, when we talk about violence, we talk about property, right? There are times when we talk about people, but the two forms of violence that in society we get most upset about is profit or lack thereof, and property. We do not talk about the violence of policy. We do not talk about the violence of lack of opportunity. We do not talk about the violence of lack of access or anything that results from those forms of violence. So those are just examples of a social contract and how it is maintained. Or another example, when we talk about forms of protest that are acceptable, right? And those things that are acceptable or not acceptable are always defined by the dominant society. Those people who belong in groups that are in power. So therefore, you have people from groups who are in power with the ability to say that taking a knee is not an appropriate form of protest, right? That speaking out, however you do it, is not an appropriate form of protest, or that something is. I was reading some tweets, and they were saying, "Oh yes, this is an appropriate form of protest when people used to dress up," and then they had a picture of Martin Luther King and others walking over the Edwards. Oh my God, blanking on the name.
That's all right. The Edmund Pettus Bridge.
Edmund Pettus Bridge, thank you. And saying, oh, this is an appropriate form of protest. Well, it wasn't appropriate in the 60s. So you have people trying to juxtaposition what is appropriate, not understanding the history, but understanding their power of what is appropriate and what is not. That's the social contract. When you have white women calling the police and expecting police to come out because there's a black man bird watching or a black family in the park, and when police actually come out because of identified black person, that is a way in which a social contract is in operation. So the social contract is often invisible. It is accepted, and it is when we go outside of those normative parameters where there are societal censures that come on us straight and heavy. And this is more about a social contract can be found in Professor Charles Mill's book of that same name, The Social Contract.
All right, now I know Colonel Russell has got to run a little bit early. He's going to have to leave us about 15 minutes early. But I do want, and so I want him to be able to weigh in on this, and I will ask any of the individuals that's in our audience, if you want to put some questions in our question and answer box, you should start doing that. We said we were going to deal with the questions at the end, but if we have some pressing questions, we may interject those in before Russell leaves us. So I'll ask Russell and also Major Franklin to kind of, if you take into consideration what you heard DeBorah and Adar say, how do you see this in law enforcement? Where are those biases and the racism, and what is that social contract?
Oh, they're alive and well in law enforcement. I can only speak for Baltimore Police Department, but I've been fortunate. I was a task force federal agent assigned to a member of Baltimore City Police Department, but assigned to FBI, DEA, and ATS. So I got a lot of exposure. Did that for about 14 years of my 20 years in narcotics. And so I will say to you, first of all, racism, period, discrimination is absolutely alive and well within law enforcement. And let me caveat by saying this: like any police would tell you, the vast majority of police officers are really, really good police officers. And then out of that, you have some really great police officers. But make no mistake about it, there are individuals. My wife was joking the other day. She says, Mel, you know how when you apply to become a law enforcement officer and they ask you integrity questions and this, that, and the third, they need to start asking, are you a member of any racial organizations like KKK, skinhead, Nazis, and stuff like that? So that's a really good, because we do have, and I know factually, within Baltimore Police Department when I was there, we have undercover people that are part of KKK and things like that, and they carry those practices out. So until you get in, so the way to resolve that is get proper leadership that don't turn a blind eye. I've seen too many leaders. I worked for 15 different commissioners over my tenure. That's a lot of commissioners. And a lot of them literally just turn a blind eye. They make sure they have a blind eye when it came to systematic and internal racism. It was a real system there. And a lot of them, and I'm not banging anybody, but some of them got up there, not a lot of them got up there, by basically turning that blind eye and becoming part of the good old boys club. So if you were a person of color, not all of them, because there were some real champions of colors that made it to the top. But to get up there, a lot of them really, I just like to say, sold their souls, right? And so you've allowed, because it's all, listen, any organization, especially in law enforcement, any good soldier is going to follow the lead of the leader, right? And so if the leader has some unbiased attributes in his personality, it's going to get filtered down. And if he's turning a blind eye, and I talked about earlier that rule without consequences, if you can get away with doing things, which we have done for many years across this country in law enforcement, and there's not going to be any consequences, or because you have white privilege, you get a slap on the wrist, if that, and a black officer gets terminated, then what you've done is you set up a system within the department, within the agency. And I will say this, throughout my tenure, what I saw in the culture, man, how do I say this? And because I just need to be brutally honest here. What I saw in the culture of policing, first of all, the thin blue line is real. Okay, you dare not cross that thin blue line. And so if you are ostracized just by blowing the whistle on something that's right, and then you're blackballed, and I mean you're blackballed from promotions, you're blackballed from assignments, you're blackballed from even getting the proper backup, then you've made it real difficult for anyone to blow the whistle and tell on his brothers and sisters. That's very difficult. I've never bit that apple, and I've suffered for not biting that apple, but I would do it all over again, because I have turned on black and people of color and white people throughout my career. But oddly enough, the ones that I turned on that were black, yeah, they got terminated. They got the highest degree of punishment. And the ones that I turned on that were white, they got swept under the carpet. And so that culture, and I will push it back and blame it on this, the real dynamic in this country, and I'll shut up with this and let Neill get in there. For me, the real change came throughout the 90s when the Big Apple, New York, adopted a policy called zero tolerance. Zero tolerance said we can arrest our way out of this. And if you know anything about law enforcement is always seeking the best practice. What is happening in the other part of the country in their law enforcement agency that we can now adopt and apply in our law enforcement agency? And basically, when the people accept their best practices, they don't tailor make them, they don't tweak them. They pick up that square policy, bring it back to their agency, and try to shove it into their round circle. And we did that during something called the O'Malley administration, where we locked up 1/6 of our population for an entire year. People's lives were ruined. People couldn't get jobs after that. And so what I'm saying to you is, when zero tolerance hit, it basically opened a Pandora's box for how we see police acting today that's getting captured by video. I think it was Will Smith said, this ain't new. None of this is new. It's just now being captured on video. It's always been there. And so we're seeing it being captured on video. And I really believe zero tolerance really kicked the door in for that. And it's making it real difficult, because it takes a real leader, to turn the tide of his department back around to get to the business of day of protecting and serving. And what most agencies have done, and most of the people have heard me say this, all they want to do is protect. All they want to do is fight bad guys, get the guns off the street, but nobody wants to serve anymore. Nobody wants to serve their community that they're sworn to protect and serve. So you know what? When I come to you, I got all the answers. I don't need your advice. Just let me handle it my way. We don't listen anymore to our community. We are occupiers. We're not partners within our community. And it's going to take strong leadership in all of those 18,000 police departments across this country, representing 800,000 police officers. And I'm not saying they're all bad, because there's a lot of great departments, but we got too many big departments that are allowing this shenanigans to go on. And I will say, I love what the chief said in Minneapolis, that apology, but how many days did it take him to say he apologized for what happened? That was so blatant, using the words of my sister Adar, what happened to George Floyd. The apology should have came right away. Action should have taken place right away. There was an arrest right away. There was nothing happened until pressure was so much that they had to do something. I felt leadership. Any city, if you're mayor, if you're manager, your city manager, if you're county executive, your police department leadership, if you're a state's attorney's office, if they're not on the same page and pushing back against this darkness, it's not going to get any better. The challenge is, it's real difficult to really police like this. It's real difficult because you're worried about your money, you're worried about your job position, you're worried about the next election, you're worried about all this stupid stuff, and you forget about the people. So you let these atrocities take place. I probably said too much. I'm going to kick it over to my friend Neill.
Well, before we kick it over, because we are going to kick it over, but before we do, I did have a question that came through to me for you, and that question was whether or not there's an opportunity for police officers to have voice. And
absolutely. So there is, but again, a lot of police officers are afraid to raise that voice. It is a rare breed officer that raises his voice because of the consequences with it, right? You get out of line, you're not a good soldier. You challenge the system, you're not a good soldier. And I've seen police after police get buried because they raised a righteous voice and the leadership heard it and they buried them. If they didn't just stop them by saying, shut up, know your place. And if that person didn't shut up and know their place, all of a sudden, in the words of Denzel Washington, I'm gonna put a case on you. Because at any time, any officer, all of us make mistakes. I've been really fortunate in my career, over 5,000 arrests, never had one legitimate complaint made against me, not one large. And so I believe I've done it the right way. Not saying I was perfect, but I've done it the right way. And so one of the things that law enforcement superiors couldn't do towards me when they didn't like that I wasn't going along with the system is they could put cases on me. Because that happens. That's a good way to shut you down. Take something away from you, threaten you with something, threaten you without taking away a position or whatever the case may be. That was never been able to do to me because they never had a leg to stand on. So it is difficult for police in this day and age. It is difficult, but it's the right thing to do to raise their voice. Unless police collectively get together, and too often they're afraid to do that. I was having a lot of police come together in my agency and saying, listen, I will be your one champion. I'm not at the top of the pyramid, but I'm pretty darn close. And I will be your champion. And when you want to raise a voice, I will fight for you. And so not only did I do that for the community, but I also did that for the police. So it's possible, but you need strong leadership, at least somebody that will stand up for the cops. Because the leader not only got to take care of his cops, he's got to take care of his community. While he's taking care of the community, he's got to take care of his cops. And that's a rare breed because.
So, Sister Linda, before we move on, can I say something to that? To
sure.
what Melvin said?
Who's that, Adar?
Adar, because you may not remember this, but I remember this. Do you remember when an incident happened to me and I called you?
Yes,
because
I do.
Nobody else was here.
I do.
And you know me, Melvin, you know, but the reason that I reached out because I knew that, number one, you know, I saw you. I saw your character. I saw who you were even as a police officer in your role of authority. I saw how you treated people. I saw how you stood up, and I saw the risk that you took. And in Baltimore, you were an example of, you know, somebody who followed your own moral code around it and who was transparent about it. So the level of trust, right? You had that. So when I came to you, and even though I knew that maybe you could not speak up within that system, I so appreciated the way that you stood with me and the way that you guided me and gave me advice about how to handle things, you know, and that for me was so, you always have been so instrumental in helping me have hope that there were good people in that system, and good people who would also fight for community and stand with community and take risk. And I, every opportunity that I get to say that, because I know I've told you this over the years, but I'm still going to say it every opportunity I get, because you have been a real one. And just like we talk about the things that go wrong, we need to and we should, but we also have to uplift those people who have always put themselves on a line to make things right. And so I to this day, I appreciate you. Thank you.
Well, Linda, just let me tell her, dear, first of all, I'm humbled by her words, and God bless you. I always want my work to speak for me, so I'm greatly appreciative of that. I love Baltimore. I love my community. I love the law enforcement agency that I grew up in, and I'm always going to fight for justice on both sides and try to break that. There should be no more owl. I want to get rid of that owl, us versus them. This should just be us, and we're fighting together as a city. So I will continue to do that. Unfortunately, my service and my style of leadership was no longer welcome, because I did fight against the system. So, you know, finally someone got in there that strategically was smart enough to figure out how to get me out of there. So, i.e., I'm still fighting on the outside. So God bless you for that.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. Okay, so
Linda, can I ask them a question?
Sure, go ahead.
So Neill and Melvin, and Neill, I know you haven't really responded to Linda's initial question, but as police officers who, I guess, stood on your own personal, as Adar said, your own moral authority, did you all ever fear for your personal safety, for that of your family, being in an environment with people that you knew probably hated you, wanted to see you off the planet, had no regard for Black human existence?
I spoke a lot, so Neill, I'll let you tackle this one first.
So, not for my own safety. I never feared for my safety or the safety of my family. But I did fear for the success of my career. Because, as Melvin touched upon, behind the scenes, it's a lot of vindictive happenings behind the scene, a lot of orchestration to get you either transferred or moved or fired because of your speaking out on issues. I do know of one particular detective, and you do, Melvin, and it goes right in line with what you were saying about speaking out and whistleblowing, and that's Joe Crystal.
Good friend.
Detective Joe Crystal, Baltimore City, who had to literally leave Baltimore City, go to Florida with his family, take his family to Florida because he reported some excessive force by a couple members of the department. And he didn't get the support from the commissioner's office. He didn't get the support from the union. He didn't get the support from anyone in positions of authority who could make a difference. But long story short, he felt afraid for himself and his family, and he left and went to Florida. And they tried to they tried to say and demonstrate and show and pulling out all the stops to show that he was a bad police officer. He was an incompetent police officer when he in fact wasn't, because when he went to Florida, he ended up on a governor's protection detail. Now, how does that happen if you're not a good police officer? You know, and during the Freddie Gray riots, this young detective came back to Baltimore on his own time, own dime, to help clean up. Now that's the kind of police officer you want. But go ahead, Melvin.
No, you're absolutely right. Joe's is an excellent example of those, and there's a bunch of Joes out there. Joe is probably the most is the one person that you could really point to because it was so publicized. And I told Joe this day, we still stay in contact. He's like a police son to me. That, man, if I was ever commissioner, I'd bring you back in a heartbeat. I've tried to get him back several times through different administrations, and that stigma and that fear of getting outside the box and not being part of the system, even as a commissioner, it still resonates. And so that's a shame. But to answer your question, DeBorah, I've never been fearful. I'm like Neill, and I've had contracts on my life. I've literally had contracts on my life on both sides of the fence. I knew they were out to get me. And so that's one reason. I guess I was concerned but never fearful, because I do believe in God. You know,
Yep.
I'm a man of faith. I love God with all my heart. And I don't think you can form any weapon. You can try to come at me all you want, but at the end of the day, I know I've got the great protector watching over me. And so if it happens, because he allowed it. But what I will say to you, I did become really concerned for my African-American males in Baltimore City, because I knew what was happening with African-American males in Baltimore City. When I say mine, I'm talking about my sons. My wife and I got a blended family of 8 kids, 6 of them are African-American boys. And I've seen when they started getting abused by police officers, where I knew a gun was going to get planted or drugs was going to get planted. And I'm not joking. I knew that was going to happen, but they were trained from home and they knew certain things to do and how to not talk back and be respectful. And my oldest son, who looks like a football player and probably enter a bodybuilding contest and come in the top 3. And he's a judo expert. When he got pulled over, or he got pulled and slammed on the back of a car by 2 inferior white guys, he could have broken both in half. He simply said, "Why you're doing this, sir?" Because all he asked was, "Can I get in my car and leave, not to disturb you?" And just by asking that question, they slammed him down the back of a police car. And he simply said, "I just want to ask you, do you know Melvin Russell?" And when he said that, they said, "Well, what do you know about?" I said, "To my pops." And they turned white as ghosts and let him go. Well, I dealt with them, and one of them got fired, the other one got reprimanded severely. So that stuff goes on. But to answer your question, no, I've never been outright fearful. My passion for doing the right thing has always outweighed my fear. I'm never going to let fear rule me.
So
I want
I
to.
just wanted to quickly answer your question, Linda. And before I do this, Brother Melvin, don't get mad at me for this when I answer this question, but I'm going to say that, first of all, Melvin should have been the police commissioner. I've been saying this for the past decade. He should be the one sitting there in headquarters right now, directing and leading from the front this police department. So I'll say that and I'll move on to the answer to the question. Sorry, Melvin, I had to do that to you. Let me just say that the policing history in this country, it's never been for the benefit of Black people. All right, the policing model that we currently have came out of slave patrols in the South. It came out of protecting the property of the wealthy in the North. It was never benefit for the Black people. So I just quickly say we need a new policing model in this country. When we talk about racism within policing and how it affects the community, first of all, internally, if we can't settle the racism internally in police departments, we're still suing police departments because of the disparity in promotions, disparity in assignments, disparity in how discipline is handed out to Black police officers within our departments. We're never going to get it right in the streets. The unions, when I say unions, I'm talking about the FOP from coast to coast in this country. The union, that is the reservoir of racism in American policing. All right, they hold on to the structural racism within policing. They hold on to that culture and attitude that's been handed down from their pappies, their grandpappies, and great grandpappies in policing. Again, relative to that policing history I was just talking about, where it came from. And the unions have to be dealt with. We also didn't talk about structural racism as it relates to public policy tied to policing, such as the war on drugs, the drug prohibition policy. That the whole thing of the war on drugs was about social control of Black folks and brown folks from Mexico. Never had anything to do with health, none whatsoever. So again, for the listeners, the viewers of this webinar, do your research on history as it relates to that piece of public policy and other pieces of public policy out there that are directly related to structural racism, institutional racism, tied directly to our criminal justice system. And we need to know about this so that when we do move forward, we know not only what policy to put in place, but what policy to get rid of and to fight very hard to get rid of. And I'll wrap it up with this.
Okay. I'm going to ask Dr. Lewis to jump in because to talk a little bit about the policy issues some of the policy issues that were raised.
Okay, it's very interesting. Listen, I'll start by saying one example of institutionalized racism that I think is critical is the failure of this country to educate Black people. Okay, and it goes back to slavery, like you said, when it was a crime or egregious to teach Africans to read. Okay, and that still persists in terms of institutionalized racism because of the way public education is financed, all right, primarily through property taxes. So you're never going to have a equal system. I'll just leave that. Now, going back to policy. So from listening to the conversation so far, it's obvious that the police have a lot of work to do in terms of dealing with their culture. All right, and that's an internal thing, as Major Russell said, because there's 18,000 different police departments, and there's no blanket way to deal with that. So each of them are going to have to deal with it on its own. However, there are some things we can do, all right, to make change. And going back to that question, is this time different? So the only way we're going to know whether or not this time is different is if we can make it different. If and that means we have to go to the polls. All right. The only reason number 45 is in the White House is because not enough Black people in Detroit and Philadelphia went to the polls. Now, I'm not blaming the people for not going to the polls because they probably didn't have a clue who this guy was. But I was from New York, and I knew that he was going to be a basket case. So I'm not surprised. Now we do know. So there's no excuse in November if we don't go to the polls. Young people, they can get out and march all they want. They better get to the polls. All right, so one last thing I'll say. So I was a little late getting here this afternoon because I was on the phone with Chris Van Hollen's office. Okay, working on some kind of response to what's going on. So two ways. So I use most of my work is in Congress. So we know that Karen Bass introduced a bill earlier this week that would try to hold police accountable. For one example, ban the chokehold. Well, the federal government can't ban the chokehold because that's an individual decision by the police departments. However, they can hold funding for those departments who do not ban the chokehold. On another issue is and I think that Brother Neill and Brother Melvin could weigh in on this, is that many police departments complain because they have to do quote unquote social work. All right, so that a lot of the work that they do is not law enforcement, but they have to often call to some issues to deal with social work. So one of the things we were doing today was coming up with a system wherein 911 calls would be redirected to a community entity that would respond with the proper response. So if it's a domestic violence issue, if it's a mental health issue, then you send social workers, even with the police. And this is being done. This is being done around the country, and we're going to have a briefing in July where we're going to bring some people who do this work to talk about what are the best practices for communities to move some of that non-law enforcement work to different places.
I want to jump in on what Dr. Lewis was saying there about partnerships between the police and social workers. So here in Washtenaw County, our sheriff's office partners really closely with our community mental health. And in terms of trainings that our deputies receive, I mean, they receive trainings on mental health first aid, de-escalation trainings, and frequently they will go out, if there's a call for service, they will go out with a social worker. And when we're having this large conversation about how do we move forward, part of what we need to do to move forward is, like Dr. Lewis said, we need to take a look at the vast number of police departments across the country, and we need local change. I mean, so with all the protests, once the protests start to to die down, I mean, we need to galvanize the people and then focus those efforts on making these local changes. I mean, what kinds of changes do we need in your city police departments and your county police departments? I mean, do we need to look at policies that will push forward community policing? So we have officers that police areas and where they live, so we don't have people coming in to police others. And then what do we do about mental health for officers? Because we know that trauma will affect police officers as well. I mean, that certainly affects the way that they do their jobs and how they respond to incidents.
So when we're talking policy, can we also acknowledge that with policy comes resources? And if we're, policy alone, policy is a great thing, but resources drive everything too. And so when we're talking about giving more resources, or resources so that there is a policy, social worker partnership, we're talking resources. If we're talking about defunding police, and the way that I understand it is diverting some of those resources to front end programs that will keep our young people out of the system, and that will increase the viability of our vulnerable communities. That's a resource issue. We've got the resources. What we often do not have is the societal understanding or will, nor do we have the political will for it. And those are things that go with a ballot box and with a vote, but that's not the only thing, that a vote will not just get you that. And when we're talking about voting, who votes and who doesn't, if we're talking about that, we cannot just talk about people not coming out to the polls. We have to talk about which polling areas get resources, right? Where you can go in 10 minutes, 5 minutes, and vote, as opposed to waiting for 3 hours. Yeah. To vote, because the 2016 election was the first presidential election since the Voting Rights Act was gutted. And when we talk about who voted, who didn't, what communities, what didn't, we never mentioned that piece. And that was a policy violence piece. Yeah. That when we talk about violence, we do not talk about. We have to restructure our conversation. That is just as important as everything else that we're doing.
I'm now appealing to all of you to give me some advice here. I don't know about the rest of you, but I've been getting a lot of phone calls since this happened from people saying, okay, what can I do? And I know last week on the calls, I mentioned I do, compliance and ethics works, but my training is as a lawyer. I graduated from University of Pennsylvania in 1986, law school. Last week, I had 4 of my law school classmates attended the session. I know there's at least 1 or 2 of them that's on the broadcast today. I've had another call from a woman who's a lawyer, who's a compliance officer, and she said to me, "Tell me, what can I do as a privileged white woman to help?" I'm also a part of the National Wellness Institute, and we just put out a statement. I'm the president of the board of the National Wellness Institute, and we put out a statement asking wellness professionals basically to take a pledge to say that they are going to help effectuate change. So now that we're talking about all of these things that, we need to do and where we can have some impact, what do we say? What do I say when I get those calls from my colleagues who are compliance officers, who are wellness professionals, who are lawyers, to say, "Linda, guide me, what can I do?"
Okay, I'm going to give a real basic response, and you all forgive me if you think that it's silly. There is a saying that is, you be the change you seek. So the first place that you have to begin is with yourself, which means looking yourself in the mirror and being very honest and identifying how it is that you personally, I'm going to make this personal. How am I personally contributing to the problems? What am I doing? And I think it's from that point that real change begins to occur. Because institutional whatever, systemic whatever, cannot occur without human energy, which is human beings, the human mind creating it. So what mind exists within that human being that causes them to create, perpetuate, instill, impose acts upon other people that dehumanize them? What exists within my mind? I'm making this personal, that causes me to participate in that act. So I really believe that you must be the change that you seek, which means you got to have a real honest conversation with yourself. Now, do human beings have the ability to do that? I don't know. Do I have the ability to do that? Most of the time, because we like to fool ourselves too. We like to create excuses for who we are and what it is that we do, instead of seeking out the higher side of who we are, our own personal goddess and our own personal God. So that's my response.
That, DeBorah, that makes me think about the statement that Brother Latif Rashid, who was one of our profound conversationalists last week, ended us with the profound conversation by saying, which is from the Quran, I will not change the condition of a people until they change what is in themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And so what I heard you saying is that, you know, we got a lot of work to do within ourselves. And that is one of the first pieces of advice when we get that call, what can I do, is to employ on people to start to make the change within themselves. Mm-hmm. So thank you for that statement. Mm-hmm. And I know someone else wants to jump in here. I can see the looks on your faces.
I'm trying to give other people room to speak.
Yeah, I'll just say something real quick. Again, that we need a new policing paradigm, a new policing model in this country, because the one that we currently have wasn't never designed for Black folks. It wasn't for our benefit. Let me put it that way. It was designed for us, but not for our benefit. And I'll just comment real quickly on what Camden, New Jersey did. They literally fired their police department and restructured it. Right now, the new police department is doing quite well, but I fear it reverting back to some of the days of old. They were able to effectively eliminate the union in doing that, and at least what has resurfaced as the union, at least it is a collection of a more diverse group of members of the police department versus a predominantly white organization. And also they don't have the political power that they had with the old police department. And it gave them a chance to filter out the problem police officers, because when they rebuilt the police department, everyone, including the chief, had to reapply. And if there was baggage, they weren't allowed back on the police force. Mm-hmm. So it gave them that opportunity. Hopefully, if they have policies and things in place as they hire new officers, to make sure they're hiring the best, using the right instruments and evaluating those officers, and then making sure that management, as it is now, maintains that very high level of integrity in ensuring that these police officers are doing what they should in interacting with the citizens. And again, we just have to limit the police and the responsibilities that we give them. You know, such as police should not be involved in civil processes, levying civil fines on people and so on. Bottom line is the police should be protecting people from other people, not involved in many of the things that we currently have them involved in.
We're going to take a couple of questions. I know we're close to the end. I've been weaving in some of the questions that I've seen come through the chat, but I want to open it up. I'm not sure if Kareem or Erica is going to help us with the questions, so I will turn it over to one of you can kind of jump in.
All right, yes, I do have a question, and it is actually directed towards Dr. Lewis. So the question is, well, it starts out, a statement that Reverend Al Sharpton made recently at one of the services for George Floyd, "Get your knee off our necks," comes to mind when I ask this question. A young African-American male at the age of 17 years old is charged with a felony. Today, in his 40s, this charge continues to appear and is brought up each time that he attempts to advance at his place of employment. Any advice or resources?
Okay, and this goes back to my earlier. Our government matters. Laws matter. So voting matters. Okay, going back to the Second Chance Act that Danny Davis had got passed years ago. I think it was around 2008. There was a provision in that law that would where felons could have their records expunged after 5 years. Okay, but it was one senator who refused to go along, so they took it out of the bill. But that's the kind of thing that we need. We need to have on our books.
I just want to acknowledge, because we are close to 2:30, and I know one of our panelists did have to depart already, and that was Russell, and I think Neill also has a hard stop at 2:30. So I just want to thank him for joining us. And if the rest of us have a few more minutes, maybe we can field a couple of more questions. If anyone has to jump off, just know that this is being recorded, and you can catch the podcast, the audio, or you can catch the video. So I will then.
Thanks, everyone. Great panel. Thank you for the invite.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
The hate that has created hate has created an environment where we are guarded around our own people. Does self-hate contribute to the blank check given to law enforcement?
I like to respond to that. Yes and no. I'm gonna deal with the no part first. We did not end up, we are the descendants of a people who did not buy a ticket on a boat to come over here. We did not ask to come over here. Now, if you go into some ancient history, have Africans been traveling to this part of the world for eons? Yes, we have been. But on this most recent journey that brought us here some 400 years ago, no, we didn't ask to come. We are here as a direct result of Europeans coming into the continent and stealing us. Were there some Africans that participated? Yeah, there were a few along the coast. There were. But for the most part, Africans were not participants in our enslavement. We were the victims of it. So no, we ain't got nothing to do with the hate that hate produced on the no side. On the yes side, when you do not love self, you can become a tacit and an active participant in someone else being able to infiltrate and take, because divide and conquer is real. So when you don't love self, it is damn near impossible to love anybody who looks like you, who sounds like you, who dresses like you, who talks like you. It really is. So, it's like, okay, they doing that to each other, and we hear white people say this all the time. They kill each other. What difference does it make? They call each other nigger. How come we can't call them nigger? So, yes, we can be participants in it, but there's an aspect of it we have nothing to do with the hatred. And, sometimes I wonder if it's even hatred, because there has to be a lack of love that people who want to dehumanize other people have, even for themselves, that they don't see a relationship to other members of the human family, that they don't see the commonalities between themselves and the other members of the human family. They don't see the necessity to take care of our great mother, the Mother Earth, that if we don't take care of her, she is not going to take care of us. In fact, she's going to wreak pure havoc on us. So I think that there is a relationship there.
And if I can jump in, you know, oftentimes we talk about things from the personal as opposed to the institutional. So when we talk about the, you know, relationship between community and police, right, or race relations, we take the component of power out of it. So if we're talking about hate producing hate, we can talk about internalized oppression. We can talk about the way in which Black folk are receive and inculcate the messages about who we are, what we are, our role and status in society through the white gaze. That's something that we grow up with until we decolonize our mind. But talking about hate versus hate, Black people in this society have been awfully forgiving. We forgive our murderers. We forgive our oppressors. We do not operate in the same way that people with power in this country have operated. So the hate versus hate paradigm is not even one that is historically correct, number one. Number two, when we're talking about policing and we're talking about forms of institutional violence, for us to talk about it as if it were an interpersonal relationship and not a relationship of power does a great disservice to what really is going on. It basically is a deflection that allows the circumstances to continue and that power element to continue, because then we get distracted because we're caught up in talking about the individuals involved than in talking about the structures and the systems that support the power dynamic and the ways in which it falls inequitably on vulnerable people. So I just want to put that out there so that we can think about that with the question, because maybe if we thought about it from that way, the question would be reframed to acknowledge that.
Some of you all saw me just, raise a book. I wasn't trying to be facetious or anything, but the man who founded Better Family Life, Malik Ahmed, wrote a book recently called From the Projects to the Pyramids in Search of a Better Family Life. And in the journey of his own personal life, he captured so much of what we've been talking about in this conversation today. He witnessed it. He saw how the systems of government, from the FBI to the Drug Enforcement Agency, to African Americans just being unjustly locked up, to the riots in New York, how those things got us to where we are today. It was just published last year. So I would just encourage the participants, the audience participants, to get a copy of it and read it, because it has helped frame for me the conversation that we're having right now. And I just want to say the name of the book again. It's called From the Projects to the Pyramids in Search of a Better Family Life, and it is available on Amazon. And this is what it looks like right here.
Linda, may I go back to your last question about what people can do?
Yes.
So just very practically, for people who are white, find a showing up surge, showing up for racial justice. Find a chapter near you so that you will have a safe space to explore what being white means in society. Oftentimes as a facilitator, I hear white people say, but I'll never understand what it is to be Black. I'll never understand what Black people go through. You don't have to understand what it is to be white. And understand what the currency of your whiteness and what that gets you and your family. Explore that, understand the day-to-day operationalization of that. And then you can figure out how you want to use your privilege to disrupt, because you can't give it back. It's no sense of feeling guilty about it. Figure out how to use it as a tool for disrupting the racialized dynamics of our society. For everybody, regardless of race, understand the history of this country, not the mythology of this country, the history of this country. There are so many good books out there to read. Go to Google Baltimore Racial Justice Action and go on that website, and you will see such a reading list, because we are inculcated into American mythology of land of the free, home of the brave, the police system is good, as opposed to coming out of the slave patty rollers system. Understand the history so that you can know how to disrupt. And then finally, throw your bucket down where you stand, as Booker T. Washington?
Booker T. Washington, yes.
As he said. And that means, do the work in your own families, do the work in your own institutions. If there is a high level of risk for you, ask questions. And if you will go on the Associated Black Charities website, you will see a couple of 10 essential questions documents, one for employers, one for workforce, one for policy, and one for philanthropy. And there are 10 questions or 20 questions for you. If you do not know the questions to ask, those brochures are ready-made. So wherever you are, within whatever institution, with whatever public office you're running for, with whatever candidate you want to interrogate, there are questions written out so that you will be able to at least disrupt in that low risk way. Those are practical things that anybody can do. And if you are wanting to disrupt, to create a better country for all of us and our children and those that we love, at least take the risk to ask a question. So BRJA, or Baltimore Racial Justice Action website for reading lists, and Associated Black Charities website for the tools. It's 10 essential questions brochures, a tool to help you answer the questions wherever you want to practice your privilege and the disruption of that privilege.
So I'm going to ask all of our panelists, because I know you all have some great resources. If you can share those resources with Muslim Life Planning Institute, we will commit to either getting them up on our website or sending them out to the attendees. So please, like after this ends, just do it while you're thinking about it. Shoot us something. Because we know what you want, so shoot it while you're thinking about it, and we'll commit to
shoot it in a good way.
Yes, in a good way, and we'll commit to getting it out. And I see my partner Kareem Ali has made his camera visible, which makes me think he's got some closing remarks that he would like to give. So.
Yeah, thank you, Linda. Yes, a very engaging conversation, and I just wanted to end with some thanks. First of all, I want to thank our listening audience, those that are still with us beyond the 2:30 time frame, and those that joined us earlier and had to leave. I want to send out some special thanks to our team, our executive team, our economic development officer on travel, safe travels to Samuel Sharif and his family as they're on the road, winding their way through the countryside right now. And I want to extend a special thanks to Linda Howard for an excellent job in hosting our program, and our executive team has taken on the work to really write this show every week. And this is in our 11th week, and it has not been an easy chore, and we're looking forward to next week as well. Special thanks to the Muslim Life Planning Institute and the network and all affiliate volunteers and supporters of our organization, the Aliyah Network of Diversified Holdings. I want to thank the Associated Black Charities for their contribution to this work. I want to thank Better Family Life, the National Wellness Institute. I thank the Congressional Research Institute for Social Work, the CRISP organization, Erica Christie, who is much more than an engineer and support person. She's photographer extraordinaire, production expert for any support work that you might need in that way, please look up Erica Christie and our lovely communications consultant, Khadija Ali. Thank you all. And we look forward to coming back to you next week with another program. I believe we'll be moving back into the space of public health and speaking with some transplant community professionals regarding that industry and the impact of COVID-19. Linda, thank you so much, and I'll give it back to you to close out.
Okay, my closing remarks are thank you. This has truly been a profound conversation, and I hope that all of our panelists become participants in the audience for the next week's profound conversation, and we have an opportunity to bring you back again as profound conversationalists. And thanks everyone who tuned in, and we hope to see you again. Thank you.
Thank you all so much.
Yes, and thank you all so much. Have a great day. Be safe and stay well.
You all too. Bye-bye.
Bye.